oppression, but rather a grammar of liberation, end quote. Tropical aesthetics thus allowed these artists to visually articulate a different way of knowing and imagining the world. Since geography in a material and discursive sense is never fully secure, given that three-dimensional space is socially produced, the idea that belonging to a place could lead to a socio-spatial liberation is seldom realized for many Black people. Due to these limitations, tropical aesthetics allows for a critical imaging and reclaiming of space. And through art, one can reify social geographies through the manifestation of what McKittrick calls alternative geographic formulations. Indeed, as the artists and performers explored in this book have proven, art can bring into fruition a different sense of place. This was certainly needed in the United States during the dreaded Jim Crow era that Black Americans endured in the South. The Great Migration ultimately proved to be a feasible means of defying the limitations that African Americans experienced of being reduced to an ungeographic existence. Their traversing across the American continent from the South to the North was a means of attaining sociospatial liberation. For Caribbean peoples migrating from rural to urban centers within respective islands or to other islands in the archipelago, as well as to the neighboring continents of North and Central America, were all endured to escape poverty, servitude, and the institutionalized oppression that colonization mandated in order to achieve the same socio-spatial liberation. At the quotidian level, these Black Atlantic peoples created alternative geographic formulations in order to have a sense of place, a rootedness they desired in order to attain some semblance of sovereignty. Although their new environments may not have resembled what they were accustomed to, they could still envisage the possibility of agency and realize the promise of freedom in their natural surroundings. These notions are fully present in the works of Wilfredo Lam, Aaron Douglas, Maya Angelou, Josephine Baker, and early 20th century Trinidad Carnival through the employment of tropical aesthetics. The surrealist notion of the marvelous real is a crucial means through which tropical aesthetics can be galvanized. Cuban critic and novelist Alejo Carpentier asserted that the marvelous, quote, arises from an unexpected alteration of reality, the miracle, from a privileged revolution of reality, an amplification of the scale and categories of reality, perceived with particular intensity by virtue of an exaltation of the spirit that leads it to a kind of extreme state, end quote. And Neil considered how one's relationship with the terrain can be recuperated through this notion. For him, the land of the marvelous is a stunning revenge against a disheartened life, since everything becomes possible in this existence. One can overcome spatial boundaries and therefore cross infinite distances, and one can also transgress temporal limitations, since in the event of an inadvertent death, one can be reborn into a more beautiful life. Many believed that dreams ensure the advent of the marvelous, and this imagined marvelous actualizes in time and space through the human body. This empowering discursive trajectory is in tandem with the spirit of self-definition and transformation Black people believed modernism symbolized for them at the dawn of the 20th century. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but I felt it was a great way for us to sort of at least, think about tropical aesthetics, right, in the context of that time period.
Yes, thank you so much. And the question that came up for me, because so much of this is about land and geography and kind of a rootedness and also an unrootedness, that I was curious about, and this question is truly for both of you, your own relationship with the land and how that informs your work, and in the writing, and of course, Vaughn, your own work, what that means, land for you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I wanted to, what I think, there's many things, but one of the things that I thought would be interesting when I think about your work in terms of socio-spatial liberation. There's this story by Derek Bell in The Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Afro-Atlantica. And it's a story that it starts off with rumblings in the ocean, and then this island appears. And it's soon discovered that only Black people can survive on this island. And so there ensues this huge debate over whether or not Black people, it's Afro-American centered, the story. Should we leave the country that we helped build to go to this new place? Should we, is it maybe just convenient for the powers that be that we do that? Should we stay and fight? Like it's basic, it's most of the story is actually the wrestling and the conversation around what is our past, present, and future, and the connection to land and space. In the end, it's decided that a small group are going to go to the island and try to populate this island. And as they start to head out, the rumblings in the ocean begin again, and the island disappears back into the sea. And what I find most interesting about that story is it's not really about, at the end, it doesn't produce a sense of despair, because really it's about the process of imagining. It's the process and it's the engagement, that it's an engagement in what these kinds of spaces can be for us, what they mean. And I feel like, so I was curious because I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it is an island that he's talking about in his story. And I was really impressed or really moved in thinking through Aaron Douglas's work and the use of foliage and aesthetics and kind of the use of creating the connection to the land to really think through spaces of freedom.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of my first response to.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because it's such a powerful story, and it makes you, it's a reminder, I think, of how speculative these narratives are, these ideas, and even this notion of tropical aesthetics for me too, because I'm immediately reminded, probably because, like I'm a bit homesick right now, especially, like we're talking about the Caribbean. I'm immediately reminded of the David Rudder song for a Lonely Soul, and the beginning of one of the stanzas, he says, "A mind's excursion." The song, if you're familiar with the song, it's the chorus is soca music, take me back to my island, and one of the the lines of the stanzas, he said, "A mind's excursion could take me to a far off country road, sticky mango juice running down my naked chest." And, it just really reminds you of the importance of the imagination and how it could be used as a means, not only of survival, but also as a means of, creating a new realm of possibility. Right, even though it may not necessarily be thought of as rational or plausible, right? I mean, I think that's essentially what this notion of the marvelous real is, using one's imagination as a locus, as a point of escape, as a means of changing one's perception of one's environment. And I think that's the beauty of visual art, because it makes us think about and visualize and our everyday world, our natural or built environments in new and imaginative ways. And so this, I think that interesting theme of the speculative and that particular story that you quoted and discussed, Vaughn, I think it certainly also runs through a lot of the the artworks that I explore in the book, and even yeah, I mean, certainly with, the Aaron Douglas work as well, even though it's so historically rooted, his aspects of Negro life and that particular mural series and other works, right? Or even thinking of the Wilfredo Lamb paintings, like The Jungle, for example, he literally reimagines and represents the landscape in a new way, right? And in a very imaginative way. But situating the Black, the Black body and the Black Cuban in it, thinking about and being cognizant of the history of the heritage and that legacy of slavery, of colonialism, but even overcoming that, right? So yeah, so I think that certainly was something that I was constantly cognizant of. I mean, for me, when writing this book, I think a huge part of it was this personal, my, longing to see, every day the beautiful, mountain range that I could see from my bedroom window, in my childhood home, my family home, because I live in a valley. I'm from Pity Valley in northwestern Trinidad, and so it's the mountains surround you, and it's such a beautiful, rich greenery, and it's so in many ways, and in the same way in which Black people, and now, especially now, like given everything that we are going through during these past couple of years, are using their imaginations to create some form of utopia, right? And it's so needed and necessary right now. Ideas about the Black speculative, Afrofuturism. I mean, I think there's a reason why there's such an increased curiosity and interest in these genres and types of like writings, but even artistic works as well. But yes, that certainly was a means through which I could cope with not being home, but also I recognize that perhaps that was perhaps a means through which these artists could really visually express the many longings, right, of people, members of the Black Atlantic, who were trying to have some sense of belonging, right, have some sense of sovereignty, but Black sovereignty in the Americas, right? But yeah.
I think I connected so much to that section of your work because, and this also speaks directly to Lauren's question about like why or what maybe drew us to thinking about relationships with land. Being from the United States Virgin Islands, or actually officially it's called the Virgin Islands of the United States, we exist in this incredible liminal space, which I think in the time of many of the artists that you're writing, being Black in relationship to the United States is also kind of a liminal space, because when you're thinking about the ideas of Americanism and the manifest destiny and their relationship to an expansionist view of land, what does that mean as a Black person when you're so much excluded from so many of the systems? And as Virgin Islanders, our citizenship is also quite limited, but it's limited through space. So although we're United States citizens, if we migrate to the US mainland, we now suddenly become full citizens. Once we keep inside the colonies in the Caribbean, that citizenship is reduced. And so for me, the land has, we're also kind of named the Virgin Islands, which is very much in terms of like the colonialist aesthetics of conquest and land is virgin. And what does that mean to be from this space where even in the naming, it's a social construction, even virginity is a social construction, the concept of virginity. And so for me, it's very much about creating like when I work with it in my work in the series that I was referencing, it's very much trying to not only disrupt the tourist gaze, as you mentioned in your book many times of many of the other authors, to disrupt the colonial gaze, but really to reconstitute the land. And in some ways, as you comment, like to cannibalize some of these same images to create something totally new. And so I was very curious what you thought about this idea of artists cannibalizing tropical images to create something new. And, if you had seen, like for me, I think the biggest question, of course, being situated in the Caribbean is we're constantly also having to push against those images. They're quite tyrannical because they're used to sell the Caribbean to tourists. And it's sometimes so difficult to distinguish your authentic self from this self that's being sold back to you. And sometimes you feel like there's no difference really at all, although your spirit knows there is.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious what you thought, what your thoughts were on that. Like,
Yeah.
how have you seen, maybe the question is more, how do you disentangle that and your concept of cannibalism in the book? Is that a way to disentangle yourself from this, or is it just a way to transform it? I guess is maybe the more pointed question.
Yeah, that's a really great question because in my use and exploration of this notion of that type of cannibalism, right? I'm stemming from and I'm gleaning from De Andrade, my Brazilian Portuguese is terrible, so excuse the pronunciation, but his notion of anthropophagia, right? And then also I'm looking at Susan Césare's writing too, and she says, like Martinique, we have to cannibalize what will become of our destiny, right? And I think for me, when thinking about this notion of cannibalizing, yeah, I just completely lost my train of thought, but because I was thinking about all of these ideas, when you were talking about the touristic gaze, and yes, so I'm remembering, so those were certainly two points of reference that were really important in this notion. But I also, I'm very, very much indebted to René Menil, the Guadeloupean. Was he from Guadeloupe or Martinique? I think he's from Martinique.
I think he's from Martinique.
Right, as well, right? The Caribbean surrealist. He was one of the the editors and the founders of the Tropique journal. And, that essay he wrote on colonial exoticism and how we as Caribbean people, we don't even know who we are because we are waiting for them to tell us who we are, and so we become decorative, right? Just another part of the terrain of that the beautiful lush Caribbean landscape. And so and so what do you do with that, and certainly he does provide some form of resolution in the essay, but I thought like another way to take it further was really investing and really embodying this notion of the cannibal, and it is like this large overarching question. How do you do that? But I mean, I think in the spirit of Andrade, you do literally consume the colonizer in an effort to reassert oneself, right? And create and engender one's own notion of what it is to be, from the United States Virgin Islands, or who we are in connection to this land that we inhabit, and the land in which our ancestors inhabited as well, and I think it's certainly the same for other parts of the Caribbean too. But I mean, of course, this question of colonialism, or quote unquote former colonies, but because I mean, whether we want to admit it or not, in some ways we are, very much victims of neocolonialism. We would like to think that we are completely independent, but we are so very much, at the mercy of these very powerful countries, right? And this world economic order as it exists today, and so I think that's just the brilliance of visual art, is that artists like you, Vaughn, you are able to really help us imagine and envision, like what how do we define ourselves? How do we relate to the the terrain, right? And how do we distinguish our perception and our experience and our relationship with the terrain and each other from that particular kind and very limited and reductive conveyance, rendering, portrayal of the Caribbean, right? And of the Caribbean terrain and the people and our relationship with it, created by the colonizer, right? And I think it really is, unfortunately today it still is a very constant battle and struggle, because of the ongoing there's just such a repetitive, I mean, it just seems to be, different iterations, or perhaps not even that much different from what existed in the 20th century in terms of how people perceive the Caribbean, right? Because it is just, mostly one singular story, that one singular narrative or depiction of the Caribbean. Right, and it's, interestingly enough, it doesn't focus that much on the land, but rather on the ocean, right, and the seascape, right? And so, they often don't think of the Caribbean beyond the ocean and the white sand beaches, right? I mean, tourists often don't even leave the resorts, right? I mean, Trinidad, of course, our society, our economy doesn't, depend solely on tourism. So we don't have the same kind of experience or even everyday encounters with tourists, people coming from the outside. But yeah, I mean, it really is, an ongoing struggle.
And I wanted to share actually the work that you were both referencing. I can find it here. And maybe
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, this is a series that I started first in 2005 in response to this the hegemony of the tourist gaze, and just kind of thinking about new ways to reimagine that. So the series began first as thinking through these very graphic representations on white paper of a palm tree in a storm, kind of caught in a perpetual storm, kind of thinking much more, as you comment in your book, about almost like a psychic space of what it feels like to be a colonized Caribbean being. And in some ways, the trees do in some ways represent bodies, kind of flailing, bent but not broken, having to live. What does it feel like to live in a state of constant resistance? The work in some ways was foreboding, because then 2 years later, we experienced the devastating hurricanes of Irma, Maria, and many other parts of the Caribbean, but particularly in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. I know we suffered a lot. And then I returned to the work again during the pandemic. Because of the collapse of time and space, it felt like we were experiencing almost like a quiet storm. And this work, so this time I'm now adding some washes, and the winds are coming from multiple directions, not just one. And also the landscape, the horizons are multiple. So it kind of collapses the foreground, the background. We would expect that things get smaller. There's sometimes things, the way that the land and the sea is represented is kind of shifting, and sometimes it feels like it's vanishing and reemerging, very much thinking about the Derek Bell story that I told, Afro-Atlantica. And then my studio was damaged in the storm, and I lost a lot of work and I lost a lot of materials, but I was able to save and salvage some. But when I started opening up a large roll of paper that I thought it was in plastic, it started to crumble. It had because my studio had water coming into it for several months, because I couldn't get it fixed. Some of the paper kind of absorbed the water, and when I rolled it out, it started to crumble and tear. And instead of throwing it out, I realized that it was an archive to the storm. My work deals with archives in many ways. And so instead, I started doing some of these same drawings of the palm trees. And I don't know if there's a way to actually make that image a little bit bigger, but basically it's a series of ripped and torn paper from repurposed drawings. Some of the paper was damaged in the storm, and it also incorporates another vocabulary in my practice, which is small cuts and burns on paper. And the series also got progressively bigger. And this is the series that I named, that was inspired by your work, How to Imagine the Tropicalia as Monumental. And really thinking a lot about, and I wanted to talk to you actually about this phrase that you use. I think it's on page 18. And you say that I argue that the compositions in which the natural landscapes predominate should be viewed not as a visual rebuttal of modernism, but as a Black modernist representation that envisions Tropicalia as monumental and integral to early 20th century Black self-definition. So I was curious about your conceptions of the Tropicalia as monumental, and of course I can share with you mine.
Yeah, I mean, that piece, I think it's so powerful and so interesting. And, it's like a confluence of like, various, I mean, not only landscapes within the USVI, but perhaps even other parts of the Caribbean as well, right? So I think that's something really powerful about it. And I'm curious to know about why the coconut tree as well, as opposed to other crops, but yeah, we could get back to that. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think that because of the environmental determinism and this never-ending association of Black people with tropical terrains, and how that pairing has always in the Western imaginary and Western knowledge production has always been associated with notions of savagery or lack of notions of regression, right? Social, intellectual, right? Regression. I really wanted to challenge that, particularly in spaces in the early 20th century. The majority of people of African descent throughout the Americas were in mostly rural parts of, right, their respective countries. And when you think of, for example, that famous sort of like dichotomization of the Black people in metropolitan centers versus rural areas as the old Negro versus the new Negro, right? People in rural parts of the US being seen as associated with like an older time period and not necessarily with contemporary society or with modernity, right? Which was something that if one wanted to be upwardly mobile in the US, right, one wanted to be associated with notions of newness, with industrialization, right, with modernity, and that was always associated with the urban scape, right, the urban centers, and certainly in the Caribbean as well. If people because of the hardships and the lack of opportunities that certainly the limitations, the underemployment that existed in various plantations and other like farms and orchards and so forth, where people gained employment, they had to go to urban centers, right, to seek opportunities. But there were so many challenges in that regard, and people having to like move from different, like in the Southern Caribbean, a lot of people came to Trinidad, and other parts of the Caribbean, they went to like like the US, or even South America as well, actually, apart from Central America, but I really wanted to really celebrate nature, and the same kind of reverence that my grandparents, my ancestors had for nature, and understanding the importance of nature. Hello. Understanding the importance of nature, not only for our daily bread, literally, right? I mean, people in the Caribbean, I mean, I'm sure, many of your ancestors would grow a lot of their food in their own backyards, right? From the late 19th, early 20th century. But, it was also like a source of joy, and also a means of escape from the hardships of one's life, in the Caribbean during that time. But I mean, I really just wanted for there to be a rethinking, and of what modernity meant in the early 20th century, but particularly for Black people, right? Particularly since Black people were seen as the antithesis of notions of progress and civilization, throughout the Americas and, throughout the Western world as well, and so I really wanted to challenge that. And I really wanted, in many ways, to honor the ethos or, the worldview of Black Caribbean people in the early 20th century who were really continuing, the various, continuing to practice and believe in the various, philosophies of living, that their ancestors passed on to them, because if, and I think it's very much reflected too in the writings of Suzanne Césaire when she talks about this, this notion of the plant man, right? And which I'll talk about, and we'll get a sense of it more when I read the second quote, the second excerpt rather. But yeah, I mean, it very much is embedded in who we are as Caribbean people, right? In terms of our heritage, right? And the legacy that we've inherited from our ancestors in terms of their relationship to nature, even though the natural terrain was where our ancestors, even whether you are of African descent or Indian descent, right, Chinese descent, Portuguese descent, right, many of our ancestors came to the Caribbean either to forcibly labor the land or to work as an indentured, under indentured servitude, right? So it's a very complex relationship that they had with nature, and in turn we have with nature, but still it's so very important to us in terms of who we are as people. I know I went a little all over the place, but
I don't know, Lauren, did you think this was a good time to do the second quote?
Yeah, perfect timing. We're going to do the second reading, and I would encourage you all, in addition to hearing the second reading, to put your questions in the chat, and we'll go into those after that. So whenever you're ready, Samantha.
Okay, all right. So this second reading is from the Wilfredo Lam chapter, and I'm actually now gonna just talk about the sections that I'm reading are very much about the ideas of Aimé Césaire and Suzanne Césaire, whom he met on his way to Cuba when escaping war-torn Europe. He spent 6 weeks in Martinique, and I argue that is the exchanges that he had with them, their ideas were deeply influential in the art that he created once he returns to Cuba. So Aimé Césaire, a poet and writer.
Wait, on what page?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, page 65. I'm starting at the bottom of page 65. And then I'm reading, sections of 66 as well as parts of 68. So Aimé Césaire, a poet and writer, coined the term Negritude while pursuing his tertiary education in Paris in the 1930s. Soon it emerged as a literary movement that he developed with Senegal's Léopold Sédar Senghor. Césaire, who immersed himself in reading about Africa, articulated the importance of refusing cultural assimilation in his defining Negritude and called for resurrection of Black values. For him, anything that was inherent to the Black experience prior to contact with European culture ought to be prized, since the subjugation of the idea of the barbaric Negro was integral for the movement. Césaire's conceptualization of Negritude reflected the obvious reality that Black people truly participated in and influenced modernism. Certainly, one can thus define Negritude as Blacks proclaiming their, quote, Blackness as constitutive of their relation to the world around them, end quote. Césaire returned to Martinique with Suzanne in 1939, and they later launched the journal Tropique, along with other Martinican intellectuals. The periodical often published articles on natural history, and the intention was to stimulate Antillians to revere their natural environment. It also featured poetry, criticism, and articles that reflected the tenets of surrealism and radical politics. No doubt the literature reflected the Césaire's avid interest in plant life, and Wilfredo Lam, would have been deeply affected by these ideas during the 6 weeks he stayed in Martinique. Menil acknowledged Lamb's, quote, solidarity with Césare's poetry and the aesthetic of Tropique, end quote. What was even more significant about the journal was the fact that it attempted to define an Antillean identity as a mode of cultural liberation. This was critical in the first half of the journal's existence, when it was subject to censorship by the island Vichy government. This period of political conservatism played a significant part in radicalizing Black Martinicans. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom of 66 and continue from there. Yet surrealism served different purposes for each of the editors of Tropique. For Aimé Césaire, it was a poetic tool as well as a moral sensibility. Contrastingly, surrealism was a means of reflection for Suzanne Césaire and Menil that provided them with a critical foundation from which to explore the cultural politics of Martinique and the wider Caribbean. As Suzanne Césaire boldly stated, quote, "We know our situation here in Martinique, and from among the powerful machines of war, the bombs and explosives, the modern world places at our disposal, our audacity chooses surrealism, which currently offers the best chances of success," end quote. Despite their disparate incentives, the writings of both Aimé and Suzanne Césaire venerate the terrain of Martinique and exclaim the innate connection Black Martinicans have with it, while also tackling the history of slavery and the predicament of colonialism. In his book-length poem, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, Césaire writes, "To go away, I would arrive sleek and young in this land of mine. And I would say to this land, whose loam is part of my flesh, I have wandered for a long time, and I am coming back to the deserted hideousness of your swords. My negritude is not a stone, its deafness hurled against the clamor of the day. My negritude is not a leukemia of dead liquid over the earth's dead eye. My negritude is neither tower nor cathedral. It takes root in the red flesh of the soil. It takes root in the ardent flesh of the sky. It breaks through opaque prostration with its upright patience." In a similar vein, Suzanne Césaire defines the Martinican sensibility as it relates to one's environment. What at root, intimately, immutably is the Martinican, and how does he live? In response to these questions, we see an astonishing contradiction appear between his deepest being, desires, impulses, and unconscious powers, and the life he lives, with its necessities, urgent demands, and heavy burdens. This is a phenomenon of decisive importance for the future of this land. What is the Martinican? He is a plant man. Like the plant, he abandons himself to the rhythm of universal life. He makes no effort to dominate nature. He is a poor farmer, perhaps. I'm not saying that he makes the plants grow. I'm saying that he grows, that he lives like a plant. It is inspiring to imagine these tropical lands being restored at last to their inner truth, the lasting and fertile accord of man and the land, under the sign of the plant. The writings of the Césaires confirm the debilitating effects slavery and colonialism have on both flora and human beings alike. Undoubtedly, the foundation of a newly defined Black Caribbean subjectivity, or as Aimé Césaire defines it, an Antillean identity, is situated in the soil, the nucleus of the landscape. And the political, cultural, and spiritual identity of modern Black people is inherently connected to vegetation. For Suzanne, the plant is the means through which humanity can be redeemed and empowered. In the Césarean ethos, the plant connotes an African-derived worldview in which man does not dominate nature, but, quote, abandons himself to the rhythm of universal life. In tandem with this counter-ideology, the plant can be recognized as a symbol of slave insurrection, since the plant man has no desire to dominate and exploit nature for the sake of capitalist expansion, but it is also symbolic of anti-colonialism and the advent of a cultural and political nationalism in the Caribbean region. It's a long one, but I thought it was important to read.
It's a long one, but it's a good one. And I wish we had more time to talk too, because we relate this plant man to Wengechi Mutu's own work and Afrofuturism and make that connection, this geological conduit to the continent. And I would love to hear about, the relationship back, right? As part of this flow of relation. Yeah.
Yes, because that was certainly one of the, this connection that the Caribbean, the Southern US, right? That this linkage that existed between these regions and continental Africa. I really believed and was able, I at least perceived the ways in which these artists, respective artists, as well as carnival masqueraders, the way in which they would, like embody this Tropicalia. I think it really was a means through which they could ultimately connect to Africa, right? And I think in many ways, I think their art was a visual and performative articulation of Pan-Africanism, that movement, right, that really was did provide members of the Black Atlantic a sense of belonging, since they couldn't find that belonging in their respective countries, and it was a means of empowerment, right? Because that movement was really for the betterment of Black people. But in regards to how this work is very much connected to the art of people, African artists like Wengechi Mutu, by all means, when you think of, for example, her work Tropicalia, it's not necessarily it doesn't refer to a specific geographical area, but I think in many ways, right, very poetically, I think it does speak to those, those interesting intersections and parallels between, right, the motherland, Africa, right, and the land, the various lands of the Black Atlantic where people resided in the early 20th century. I mean, I think it's an interesting way in which we could think of that connection and that shared experience of colonialism, of the the attainment of human rights, of civil rights, and eventually of independence. Right. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to think about these disparate parts of the Black Atlantic and how they connect.
I wanted to add to that by telling you this. I tend to talk in stories a lot. I don't know. It's probably because of my background. My father was a priest, so it was always like storytelling as a way to connect. And I spoke recently at a talk where there was a Ghanaian artist, and I was presenting a piece where I had mentioned the rebellion in St. John, part of the Virgin Islands, that happened in 1737, I believe. And it was led mostly by the Akwamu people, which is a part of the modern state of Ghana. And how, if they had been successful, they would have been the first Black Republic way before Haiti. They took charge of the island of St. John for almost a year. And the Danes had to ask many other European powers to help them wrestle back the island from these people. And when I had just mentioned the name, there was a Ghanaian artist who said, the Akwamu people are from Ghana, my country. And I said, yes, I've heard that. And he said, they're known to be people of the forest. They're known to be people of the land, and they're known to be people who hide, like they can become one with the land, is the way that he referred to it. And I thought, when I think about this concept of plant man, it makes as a form of resistance and kind of collapsing oneself back into the land to rediscover these truths, to in some ways tap into the power of the regenerative nature of the land by camouflage, becoming one with it. I find that really interesting in terms of thinking about not only the ways of considering alternative free spaces and geographies, but like how that ability has, like, especially in the context of the St. Johnian rebellion, that was precisely what allowed them to defeat the European powers, even if it was for only a temporal time.
Because I mean, that's essentially what Marinage was, right? The maroon settlements, they were those dreaded areas of the forest and the mountains where the Europeans really found it hard to penetrate, but they were able to, like you said, I mean, it was this kind of like merging, right? Falling into, yeah, so they could not be, you know, discernible.
And so I think that's really interesting, this concept of like falling back into the land or becoming one with the land in a way to hide, find identity, create space. I was telling Lauren a little bit earlier with this new series that I've thought about this action of the ripping and the tearing and almost kind of becoming one with the storm. And thinking about the ways that I'm approaching this reimagining of Tropicalia as another kind of storm. I think we often see storms as completely destructive, and they are, but they also reassemble things. They also allow for regeneration. They also allow for weak parts to be dislodged, parts that we no longer need to kind of be dislodged. And so I think it's an interesting way to, again, think through these alternate geographies and free spaces, you know, just how tapping into the land and tapping into the forces of nature allow one to, and attempting to visualize that allows us to think through those spaces differently.
Yes.
Well, listen, I've loved this conversation. I hate to end it now, but I will. I do want to encourage you. Vaughn is online. You can find her, and she often posts where she is at and where she's speaking. And Samantha, I know that you said you have a new book coming out, so I think we're waiting for that.
Oh no, it's not coming out yet.
You're working on it.
Still in the writing.
Yeah, because I just started working on it, so
okay,
it's not coming out anytime soon. I mean, that would be amazing.
Tropical Aesthetics is still available, and I encourage you all, if you haven't had a chance, please, you can read that. And for those of you who do want a signed book plate, I will send an email and you can fill in the form and you will get that book plate. We will arrange that following this. But again, I just want to thank you both, Vaughn, Samantha. Thank you all for coming. I really love, hearing the conversation, being a part of it. And again, you're two people who I just enjoy hearing and reading about. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.